Okay, I think it's almost the time. It's about 2:10 in the PM, and I think that most of our students are online and try to listen to Professor Huang's talk now. Although there are some students still have other events and cannot join now, but we should not waste our time for waiting. So I would like to firstly introduce Professor Hsu-Wen Huang from the Hong Kong City University of Hong Kong before she gave the talk. Okay, Professor Huang, she received her education from the Yangming University, and now it is a combination of Yangming and Jiaotong, so it's now Yangming Jiaotong University, and she obtained her bachelor, master, and doctoral degree there, and have a strong record in the neurology and brain science. And afterwards, she received some postdoc training, and then she located in the City University of Hong Kong in the Department of Linguistic and Translation. And today, she is going to give a talk on brain sciences and linguistic cognition for the elderly. And so I think that some of our students know the function of the WebEx. So if you note it, please use the emoji of clapping hands, okay? But if you do not know it, please try to find out where it is and clap your hands. Let's welcome Professor Wang for her excellent talk. Thank you.
Okay, can you all see my slides?
Yes, clearly. Okay.
All right, thank you for the really kind introduction, and I see some of thumbs up and clap hands, so that I think that's good to start. Okay, so today I'm going to share some of my research that is about language processing in the aging brain. So I mainly talk about language processing because language processing is a very important skill for maintaining a normal everyday life for humans. And also this ability for understanding language plays a very unique position in the cognitive aging research. Because as opposed to attention, memory, and other executive functions, most of these cognitive phenomena will decline with age. However, it seems like very important aspects of language processing have been relatively protected against age-related degradation. However, throughout my talk, I would like to highlight that despite we see that older adults are okay to process language, there are a lot of neural mechanisms that changes still in the aging brain, so that the elderly are trying their best in order to understand and process language normally. Why language? Because language is not only a special ability, but also we use language for all kinds of processing, including memory, learning, and trying to pay attention to things. So to successfully comprehend language or linguistic materials like words or single words or sentences, the perceptual events that's experienced through different modalities must be really rapidly analyzed and retrieved. And also humans need to combine those information and integrate those information with their long-term memory and use their experience, lifelong experience, to interpret and make the responses accurately. Remarkably and amazingly, the human brain seems to have the ability to accomplish this kind of complex process really fast and effortlessly over time. So in my study, I always present some materials that's like an input in the environment. So that's perception. And I try to use, most of the time, I primarily use EEG, the electrical activity measured from the brain, in understanding their process, mental process. I also collaborate with other researchers in using the structural imagings in understanding the structural changes in the aging brain. So what I measure their output from the behavioral as well as the neural level. So behaviorally, I will try to understand whether they can understand or how they misunderstand the linguistic materials and how they make decisions about the materials they have processed and how they solve problems. So this is the scenario of the hypothetical idea of my research. So I mainly study the mental process. So you may wonder why language is even interesting to and spend time to study. So I want to share a very short video to highlight this amazing ability. And a lot of times, misunderstanding creates a lot of funny events. So I hope that you could watch this video and hear the sound. So this coach is telling the young kid to swing and trying to focus. So the coach said, keep your eye on the ball. The kid doesn't really know what is the meaning for that, keep your eye on the ball. So that means watch the ball. So the kid just get the literal meaning, so that keep his eyes on the ball. So that is part of language processing, part of language comprehension, so that he did not actually misunderstand, but he did not get the actually implicit meaning of the sentence that the coach just mentioned. So given the prominent role of language in all kinds of aspects in learning and everyday life, so it is really important to understand how the perceiver, how people understand and process language. And ultimately, the instructors, teachers, and even caregivers need to adjust themselves in using the correct ways in the language information, in guiding the learners, and maybe provide better care for the participants, for their families as well. So that's, I hope that you get the idea that why language comprehension is interesting topic to study. So today I'm going to mainly talk about two lines of research. One line I will talk about age-related changes of hemispheric asymmetries in language processing. And the second lines of research, I will focusing on talking about individual variations throughout the lifespan. So first of all, hemispheric asymmetries. So why we need to look into the hemispheric differences? It is because in the past, we already know that the process of identifying the information, linguistic information, that has been done, a lot of study has been done throughout the phasic studies. So Broca's, Dr. Paul Broca has identified that his patients would not be able to speak fluently, and later on he identified the patient has a impaired brain at the left hemisphere. So this patient was a famous one. So the only sound that the patient could make was the syllable ton. So that linking, Paul Broca has linked the left hemisphere with a fluent speech. So this was a phenomenal work that opened up the brain network for language processing is a symmetry. So that maybe left hemisphere is very important for processing language. So not only Paul Broca identified the left inferior frontal is important for processing language, for generating sounds, produce speech sounds. In a similar time, German doctor Karl Wernicke also found a different types of patients. So Wernicke's patient is able to speak fluently. However, it seems like the patient will only put a lot of words together. So that kind of generating a word salad. So that's the sentences is very hard to understand because that's a kind of like a word salad. So Wernicke found that not only the broadcast area in the frontal area is important for produce fluent speech. So there's another area also in the left hemisphere. So that's around the temporal area. So that seems to be important for language comprehension. So throughout this time, the neuroscientific field has identified that at least there are different parts of the brain that is important for language processing and production. So this all highlights the importance of left hemisphere. So that's why in the psychology field, there are a lot of pop science. They're trying to develop a very simple test in trying to understand whether a person is a left brain person or a right brain person. So for instance, this is a very popular and easy test that's being used in the pop psychology. So for those, so people who place their left thumb on top of their right thumb, they tend to be right brain dominant person and vice versa. So there's no doubt that the hemispheric specialization are important properties of the human brain. So throughout the years of studies, a lot of studies identify that this is the left hemisphere, this is the right hemisphere. So it seems like the left hemisphere is important and good for generating speech sounds. And also, left hemisphere is more analytical. So the left hemisphere is good for processing maybe the numbers as well as analyzing information and temporal information. In contrast, the right half of the brain, the right hemisphere, is good for processing melodies and imaginations and maybe the creativity things. However, despite that, the research has identified the importance of the hemispheric differences in different cognitive abilities. It is, I think the most important thing is the collaboration and the balance of the various neural components that could work together and form an integrated role for dealing with the task. And I think that's an important hallmark of the human cognition. And importantly, we need to know that the two halves of the brain, two hemispheres, are connected via a huge neural bundle that is called the corpus callosum. So that means the information, no matter it is perceived by the left brain or the right brain, will also be transmitted to another half of the brain for processing, so that the two hemispheres are always work together in fulfilling the tasks. So I'm not trying to talk a lot of findings by using the pop psychology method. I would like to introduce the method that I use in understanding the hemispheric differences. So that is the visual half field paradigm. So before I talk about the method I use in testing hemispheric specializations, I want to just very quickly mention that our body is contralateral controlled by the brain, which means that the right half of the brain controls the left half of the body, while the left half of the brain controls the right side of the body. So this is a contralateral control. So in the laboratory, we use the visual half field presentation method. So that means, so this is our two hemisphere. So this is the center of the screen. So in this paradigm, the stimuli can be word or pictures. The stimuli are projected to either the left visual field or the right visual field, so that toward a little bit to the left of the center or toward the right of the center. So this paradigm takes advantage of the anatomical structure of the human visual system, in which the stimuli projected to one side of the visual periphery will be exclusively received by the primary visual cortex on the contralateral side. That means when the material is presented to the left visual field, this information will first send to the right visual cortex for processing, and vice versa. So the hemisphere that initially perceived the information, therefore, has a processing advantage in terms of the timing and the quality of the information. So this visual half-field paradigm has been used for many studies and used for many years, and that could successfully induce the processing bias of the two hemispheres, so that the researcher will be able to know what the left hemisphere is good at processing information and what the right hemisphere is good at processing mode. So this is a paradigm that I will use in testing the hemispheric differences. I'm sorry, wrong direction. So the technology I primarily use is called EEG and ERP, so electrophysiology and event-related potential. So this technique is measuring the neural activity, the direct measure of the neural activity. So what we do in the laboratory is we will put a cap on a participant's head. So the cap is just like a swimming cap, but with sensors on the cap. The participants will be presented some words visually or auditorially, but now I'm going to talk about visual stimuli first. So some of the words will present visually, and the participant will see the information on the monitor. And participants need to do some tasks. For instance, understanding and comprehend language or words. And then their information, their neural activity will be measured by the EEG machine. So the information will be amplified, and we will be able to collect their continuous neural activities. And that is so-called ongoing EEG. So that is the continuous neural activities. So by using EEG, we could analyze different frequencies of the neural oscillations. For instance, alpha band and beta frequency. And when people are focusing on the certain information, their frequency modulation will be different compared to unfocused. So this is ongoing EEG. So what is event-related potentials, ERPs? So this is the event-related means that, so when the participants are focusing or looking at some of the material, so this is called stimulus here. So when the participant looking at the word on the screen, so this is so-called now the single word is a stimulus. So the computer will mark the time that the participant viewing something on the screen. So this is one stimulus, one word, another word. So this is stimulus. So after collecting the ongoing EEG, ongoing neural activity, continuous neural activities, we will do a lot of signal processing so that we will line up all the information, so that we will line up all the stimulus together, so that the time zero here, so the axis is the time. So 0 means there is a word presented on the monitor. So the participant's eyes perceive the information. So this is the time 0. So this is event. That is the meaning of event. So the y-axis is the changes of the neural activity in microvolt. So for most of the ERP plots I'm going to showing you here in my slide, in my talk, is that the negative will be plotting up. So this is so-called ERPs. so that we time lock to the event. So time 0 is the participant perceive information. And we are able to use this temporal, very specific information, the ERP components, in understanding how people process information and whether they are focusing on the event we presented, and also what kind of information that will modulate their attention and memory performance. So this is the ERP. So ERP is very good to study language processing because, firstly, language processing is really rapid. And very important language events will unfold continuously at multiple time scales. For instance, from millisecond level timing differences, there are some consonant changes until the several minutes that a discourse will unfold. Therefore, EEG and ERPs, which is a technique, has very good temporal information. So we could have this measure that give us a very good timing. Excuse me. And that we can measure the ERP components at very divergent timescales in trying to understand how people process different levels of information. So this technique allows us to simultaneously examine the multiple sentences make up a discourse and multiple words that could make up a sentence, and multiple sounds, letters that could make up a word. So it is also helpful that the ERP can be measured without a secondary task. That means it is not necessary to ask participants to do an explicit task. So participant could just see the words and trying to make sense of the words presented on the monitor, but they do not need to press a button or they do not to sound it out the word. So this advantage is that we could look at people simply in reading or listening for comprehension, so that there's no behavioral measurements necessary. So that will potentially confound with or generate some other strategies then that will impact our understanding of the results. Secondly, because of not necessary to use a explicit task, so we could measure the ERP components and ERP responses while people are understanding the materials and the sounds for the young adults and older people, as well as a young infants. And in fact, this is actually my son who actually participated in many ERP studies. So I just want to show that this technique is very safe, so that we are also able, as a researcher, we are able to take advantage of this technique in understanding all aspects of language processing for all age groups. So what we could measure for the ERP component. So there are different ERP components has been identified in the field. So if a researcher would like to know their attention modulations, then the researcher will focus on the N1, P2, and N2. So N means the negative going waveform. The number here, 1 means about the time that we will see this component. So N1 is the first negative going waveform, happen around 100 milliseconds, for instance. We can study people's language processing, and there's a specific component that we call N400. So N400 is a component happen around 400 milliseconds when the stimulus is perceived by the participant. So this is a negative going waveform. So this is N400. N400 is an index for language and semantic retrieval. So if information is more difficult to retrieve or need more cognitive resources in integrate the information, the meaning part, then they will be showing a more negative N400 component. So this is the component that is related to language processing. Other than studying the language processing, we could also study the long-term memory. You can see that whether the subject could memorize the information we presented or not, which is very good to use some of the technique in the education neuroscience field. We could also use the P300 in knowing how people make decisions, whether people are focusing on the task. So these are this is a slide I'm trying to show that by using different designs and using different ERP components, we are able to see people's cognition. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the topic of hemispheric asymmetries in processing words and phrases. So the first study I would like to introduce is the understanding of Chinese word. So that this is a study I would like to know that for processing Chinese word, compound words, that means they are two characters. So for Chinese, it is quite a lot of words share the same word forms. For instance, this word flower form, hua has multiple meanings. However, when hua is used in different words, for instance, flower garden, 花园. So now we know that the character of hua means the flower-related information. However, hua could also be used with some other word. For instance, 花招, 花钱, spend money. So in this time, 花钱, with the money as a second character, hua has different meaning. So that means a single Chinese character may carry multiple meanings. So in this specific study, I would like to know that when I present a compound word, whether the participants' two hemispheres will process the first character that has multiple meaning differently. So that is the sublexical ambiguities in reading Chinese. So the technique I use is in combining the ERP measures as well as the visual half-field paradigms. So that means the word will be presented either to the left visual field or right visual field. So I asked the participant to do a very simple task. So I present some words to them. So the participants need to make the decision whether this is a real word which has meaning or it is not a real word. So lexical decision task. So in this slide, I'm showing you that the two hemispheres processing the ambiguity differently, or solve the ambiguity problems differently. So the results showing in the left is the data from the left hemisphere. In contrast, the results showing the right is from the right hemisphere. So we see the left hemisphere data first. So now I'm focusing on whether the word has multiple meaning, so high ambiguity or no ambiguity. So that is the contrast here. So what we see here is that when the word is presented to the left hemisphere, we see the ambiguity differences on the N400 component. That means high ambiguity. So when the word has multiple meanings, then it will show more negative N400. Compared to non-ambiguous word. So non-ambiguous words are showing in the solid line. Ambiguous word is showing in the dashed line. So this effect is very clear in the left hemisphere, although the effect size is very small because this is a really subtle effect. So this is the left hemisphere. But look at the right hemisphere here. So we do not see any N400 differences or any other differences in the right hemisphere. So this result is, this is not just a null result. So that we're trying to replicate this finding in behavioral paradigms as well as in many ERP studies. So overall here, we see that the data we see here is consistent with the coarse coding hypothesis. So in the psycholinguistic field, we know that the left hemisphere will be really efficiently in trying to extract the accurate meaning really fast. So this is the possibility why we see the ambiguity differences only show when the word is presented to the left hemisphere. Why there's no differences that show in the right hemisphere? It is because in the past literature, we know that the right hemisphere will be coding the word information in a broader way. So all the possibilities are okay for the right hemisphere. So for the right hemisphere processing strategy is that, okay, whether there is a possible meaning associated with a character. If it is yes, and that's done for the right hemisphere. So that's why the right hemisphere is not very good to extract the accurate meaning when the word is ambiguous. So this is the data we found here for processing single word in Chinese. So the next study, I move on in trying to look into, okay, not just looking at single word, so how the two hemispheres integrate the information between words, so two words. So in this study, I also trying to understand whether the right hemisphere playing any important roles in processing language. So now I need to talk about our semantic knowledge. So our semantic knowledge consists of meaning we required through reading of the materials, and also the meanings that we required through the interactions with the objects. For example, when we see the word watermelon, so we know that we could know a lot of information from reading materials or Google the information. So all these are text-based information. So we know that it is a vine-like plant, and now Taiwan is the world's largest producer for this fruit. However, not only we knew all this kind of text-based knowledge, we also gain sensory-based experiences throughout the life. For instance, the sensory-based experience about the watermelon could be that, oh, we know that usually the shape is round, the color outside is green, and maybe they are red or yellow inside, and the taste will be sweet, so on and so forth. So this is the interactions of the objects, the actions and the sensory-based experience we have. So whether this kind of sensory-related processes will be triggered or modulated by the linguistic factor. For instance, the adjectives that I used in the study was the topic I addressed. So in this study, at first, I present a sequence of words as a trial, which means that I used adjectives to induce either the text-based information or the sensory and text-based information. So concrete versus abstract adjectives. So that the adjectives, for instance, leather here, leather is a concrete adjective, which has both text-based information and sensory information. So for abstract adjectives, for instance, interesting. So interesting is an example of abstract meaning, which only have text-based knowledge. We do not have intensive sensory-related knowledge about an abstract word. So I use adjectives to induce the meaning of the following noun. So the adjectives are presented centrally. So both hemispheres will receive the information. And following the adjective, there will be a polysemous noun. So the noun will be presented to either the left visual field or right visual field. So I look into how the left hemisphere use the information presented earlier, and that's triggered by the adjective, and whether the left hemisphere will use this kind of information in integrating the phrase leather book, interesting book, this kind. So the modifiers, the adjectives, will induce the different meanings of the noun. So what I'm looking at will be, and showing you in the next slide, will be the effect showing on the lateralized noun in looking at how two hemispheres integrate the information that's presented by the adjectives. So this is the data we first acquired and got from the young adult. Again, means that when we are looking at the noun, but the preceding adjective is a concrete one. So the leather book. The dashed line is we're still looking at the noun, but the preceding adjective is a abstract adjective, the interesting. $200 effect compared to the preceding adjective that is abstract. And we also see the N400 differences on the noun. So that concrete modification will show less N400. So these two components in the past literature has been associated with first, the prediction process. So that the left hemisphere is able to use the presented information and actively guess what would be the possible words for the processing. So that's why when the preceding adjective is a concrete one, which has richer semantic association and semantic information, so the left hemisphere will use this information for prediction. So that's why the concrete pair show more positive P2. So prediction may have good consequences for later on processing. So when the left hemisphere is predict the information, so later on during the integration process, the predicted ones will show less N400. So that's the reduce of cognitive resources for further processing. So this is the left hemisphere. So look at the effects in the right hemisphere. So we do not see any differences on the P200 and N400. So there's no prediction-related processing differences associated in the right hemisphere. In contrast, we see a very clear ERP component. This is so-called frontal negativity. So the effect is mainly showing in the frontal area. And what we look at is when the preceding adjective is concrete. So leather book will show a more negative frontal negativity than the interesting book pair. So imagine that the concrete ones would be able to initiate some sensory imageries. So in the literature, it has been demonstrated that frontal negativity is closely related to imagery generation. When the researchers ask participants to generate images for the material presented, then the frontal negativity will show up. So in this study, we found out that although we did not ask our participants to generate images, but participants will automatically generate some visual related imageries or sensory related experiences and this ability is induced by the right hemisphere. So that means the two hemispheres are both important for processing linguistic materials, but the two hemispheres use different strategies and make the reading process differently. So the left hemisphere will use an active and predictive process, so that continuously guess what would be the next coming word in order to make the language processing efficient. The right hemisphere plays a very important role in making the reading interesting, so that during the reading process, the generation of sensory related experience and generate some of the visual imageries in the head. And this kind of experience is initiated and induced by the right hemisphere. So this is the young adults. We continuously see the dissociation and the hemispheric differences in processing both single words as well as integrate the two words, whether they use a predictive process or they integrate the word by generating some imageries. So that overall young adults show very clear hemispheric specializations in processing language. So now I'm going to talk about some aging studies. But before that, I'll just quickly review some of the studies that are done in aging field. So cognitive aging is a global issue. So there are a lot of researchers trying to understand the aging brain. So the phenomenal and well-cited study done by Denise Park, she has done a cross-sectional study, aging data, measuring all kinds of cognitive abilities throughout the whole lifespan. So these are the x-axis are indicating different age groups. The y-axis is the performance. So the better ones are showing the skills. So different colors showing the different cognitive abilities. So their data have shown that throughout the age, there are decreases in various measures, including the processing speed, working memory, long-term memory. One thing that's standing out is the world knowledge, which may even show some improvement for the elderly. So that's this hot color, the orange and red ones. It seems like the elderly will maintain their language abilities. So now the field is trying to look into how the elderly would be able to maintain their language ability given the fact that the elderly has decreased attentional ability and memory function, as well as the executive functions, how the elderly are able to compensate those declines in order to understand language correctly. Okay. So typical aging is associated with really widespread gray matter and white matter brain changes, which show considerable region variations across the brain in timing and the rate of declines. So Ross has done a study that's compared to different age groups. So that's showing us that different parts of the brain has different rate of declines. For instance, the prefrontal areas and hippocampus has shown a very dramatic decrease. So this is the two dots are from one participant. So this is a longitudinal study. So participant will come back to do the second scan a couple later after the first scan. So the prefrontal areas and the hippocampus showing some of the decrease in the structures. However, there are also some areas that will be stable with the age. For instance, the visual cortex, so that do not see very clear the age declines. So this would impact the aging process in all kinds of cognitive domains. So some studies has already looked into how the aging brain handle the language materials. So one study has trying to understand and compare different subcomponents of language processing, because through the reading, because they focused on that reading is very important, and not only for the leisure activities, but also reading ability will help the older people to maintain the functional independence, which may also have a significant impact on their life quality. Yet, really, until now, very little is known about how the aging will affect the neural circuits of the process that underlying those skilled reading process. So this study investigates the neural correlates of sublexical and orthographic, phonological, and lexicosemantic processing in the aging brain. So they use functional MRI and compare young versus older adults. So the older adults, they recruit participants age over 65 and between 65 to 80 years old. So they ask their participants to do 4 different tasks. So the first one is called letter identification task. So in this task, they think that they will assess the sublexical orthography processing. So the participant were asked to indicate whether, for instance, they present a string, the visually presenting a string. The participant need to press a button and indicating whether there's a letter R in this string. So for this one, this is yes, this is no. So this is so-called letter identification task. The second task they use is lexical decision task with the pseudo-homophones. So the pseudo-homophones are those, for instance, brane is a noun word, but it sounds like a real word. So this pseudo-homophones are being used to assess the orthographic processing. So in this task, the participants need to say, this is a word, brain is a word, brane is not a word. So the participant could not only rely on the phonological information, but they need to really look into the orthographic process and get the information out, and knowing brane is not a real word. The third one is called phonological task. So this is testing their phonological processing. So in this task, the pseudo-homophones, for instance, roze, rose, and the matched pseudo words, run, rone, both of them are not real words. So these words are presented to participants. And the participants have to decide whether the visually presented stimulus will sound like a real and existing word. Okay, so for this case, roze, rose, should be say yes, because rose, roze, has a sound that also have a corresponding real word, rose, a type of flower. Rone is not. So this task requires the sublexical computation of the phonology, as well as to assess their lexical information. And lastly, let's test their lexical semantic processing. So they ask participants to do a animacy judgment. So bird, whether this is a object that has that has a real life. So animacy judgment. So bird is yes, it is an animate, but desk is not. So 4 different tasks has been used in assessing the subcomponents of word processing in the aging brain. So firstly, the behavioral data. So in the responses time, so that's showing you on the top. So they see that the older participants are showing data here, and this is the young data. So older participants overall will show classic response slowing effect. So the older participants showing the longer reaction times. Okay, so for all the tasks. However, we see that as for these accuracy, the older participants show very similar accuracy levels as the younger participants in both the sublexical orthographic, phonological processing, and even the older participant will outperform younger adults in the semantic processing. So in the animacy judgment, the older people actually respond better than the young adults. So this is a behavioral pattern, which is also being seen in many other studies. So what their MRI data should look like. So this is the data they see and compare the active regions for young and older adults. So we are seeing the A, B, C, 4 different tasks. So I do not want to get into a lot of details of the reading circuits, but I want to highlight that the color in red are the activation for the older people. And there are some green areas, and that's for activation for the younger adults only. So they do a conjunction analysis. So for the color of yellow, so here, these are the areas, both young adults and older adults, they both have while they are doing the tasks. So for easier, for the data, so they make a conjunction between the young versus old. So the region showing this is the regions that showing increased activation in older adults compared to young adults. So it seems like older adults also engage a very similar set of neural circuits in processing the co-components of reading, including the orthographic information, phonological information, as well as the semantic, which suggests that the general architecture of the neural reading network is well preserved across the lifespan. Importantly, we see more activations for the elderly. So some age-related differences in brain activity in all 4 different tasks. So importantly, for the orthographic and the phonological tasks, we will see more activations in the midline, which seems to engage, the older people need to engage more of the areas that's important for the memory functions as well as attentional processes and executive functions. So this may indicate that older people, they could do the task and their accuracy is also similar and even outperform as young adults. But the older people seem to engage a lot of compensatory mechanisms in doing the task. So that's showing more activations in the data. So this is an MRI data, compare different tasks. So there is another task in trying to look into the phonological processing in the elderly, because we know that processing phonological information is more difficult for the elderly. A lot of times, elderly will say that they have a tip of tongue phenomena, which means that they have the idea there, but they just cannot retrieve the correct word and sounding out the information. So tip of tongue are not caused by the difficulties in assessing in retrieval of the meaning, but instead it's a selective deficit in assessing the phonological representation. So that it has been shown that older people is suffering more on the phonological processing. So in this task, they shows that, so they compare young adults and older people. They show that the older people they are, the more tip of tongue phenomena will be generated. So they present a picture for the participants and ask participants to say, who is this? So the participant will be able to make 3 responses. One is, okay, I know who this actor is and what kind of movie and what movies this actor has been performed. So that's known. So the participants, that means the participant could retrieve all the details and even say the name of this actor. So the second possible responses would be, I don't know. So the I don't know means that I don't know this actor. It does not mean that I don't know who this is. So that's I don't know means that I don't know this actor at all. So the third response is the TOT. So the participant will say, yes, I know this actor, but I just need some more time in retrieval of the name and then potentially the movies that she has been performed. So this is TOT. So they found out that the older people will show more of the tip of tongue. So indicating that processing phonological information is more difficult for elderly. So these are some of the research that's in the field as trying to investigate how the language processing is done in the aging brain. So in my research, I just use the same paradigm I have introduced earlier in looking at young adults, how they integrate the concrete versus abstract information. So in this study, I have recruited a set of older participants and asked the participants to do the same task. So again, the participants just simply read the words and trying to make sense of the phrase, whether the phrase is good or not. So remember that in my previous study, we showed that the left hemisphere is able to predict, which shows P200 and N400 differences. And the right hemisphere, the young adult will be able to generate some imageries so that we see frontal negativity when the word is presented to the right hemisphere. However, this is our data in looking at older people. So again, this is a left hemisphere data in the left. This is a right hemisphere data in the right. So we do not see very clear hemispheric asymmetries in elderly. So that it seems like their older people's left hemisphere, they were less likely, the older people are less likely to engage the left hemisphere dominant predictive processing, so that we do not see P2 and M4 differences in the left hemisphere. Elderly also use less message level meaning information to initiate a control process, which include the right hemisphere or the initiation of the imageries, so that we don't see a clear frontal negativity, imagery related processing in the right hemisphere. You may wonder, maybe that is because the elderly just do not do the task. They just look at a single word. They do not try to integrate the two words together. So that's here we're trying to compare whether the elderly are actually doing the task. So we look into the congruent pair versus the incongruent pair. So congruent pair means that the adjective will be okay to describe the noun. For instance, volcanic mountain. Incongruent pair is that the adjective and the noun cannot go together, so it's incorrect pair. So for instance, the limpid mountain. So here we are showing, I'm showing you the very typical congruency effects on the M400. So the dotted line is the incongruent pair. The solid line is a congruent pair. So the incongruent one will show more negative than the congruent pairs, indicating that the elderly still trying very hard in trying to integrate the words during the task. So in the earlier slide, the elderly do not show hemispheric specialization in prediction and imagery generation. Is that they just maybe they just reduce the hemispheric asymmetries in doing the task. So we have identified that it seems like at the word level, only looking at single word, the older adults are okay, and then the age is less affected for the word processing. However, when the information is more complicated, in this example, only have two words at the compositional level, the older adults are less able to engage the hemispheric specialization processes. So this data, our data, also consistent with the data that consistent with the theory proposed by Roberto Cabeza, showing that when people are older and elderly, they will recruit and show less hemispheric asymmetries. So there's a model called Haro model. In short, it's a hemispheric asymmetry reduction in the older adults. So older people will be seeing that less specialization for two hemispheres. So I wonder why. So despite that, we continuously see young people show hemispheric specialization. Two hemispheres do things slightly different, but older people don't. But why? So one study we collaborate with the Dallas research group. We asked participants to do a very simple task. In this procedure, the participant just make a judgment, animacy judgment. So whether this is a word that has that's animate or inanimate. And we measure their behavioral responses as well as their brain activation. So we collect a lot of participants so that we're trying to use this set of data in understanding the Haro model, whether that's true. That when the people are getting older, then we will see less hemispheric specialization. So in order to examine this age effect in laterality of the brain activation, we use a combined bootstrapped approach in compute the laterality index based on the formula I show here. So that what you need to know is that the positive values of the laterality index will indicate the predominant left lateralized activity. The negative values will indicate predominantly the right lateralized activity. When the index is closer to 0, which index that both hemispheres are active during the task, so bilateral activity. So what we are looking at here. So there are different areas we have looked into. So that x-axis is the age groups. So the y-axis is the laterality index. So what we see here is that it's again showing that the frontal area and some of the parietal areas will show hemispheric differences reduction throughout the age. That means when we see that there's a negative correlation. So for young people, the laterality index will be high. And when people are getting older, then the laterality index will closer to 0. So that means we'll move on from left lateralized to more bilateral activation for older people. So this is the MRI data, which is also consistent with the finding that older people will show both less hemispheric differences and bilateral activations in processing linguistic materials. So far that we demonstrate the age-related differences in ERP responses as well as the brain activation. So this study, we want to know what are the contribution factors to this less hemispheric differences in elderly. So we try to look into the structural differences. It has been suggested that the age-related changes in cognitive performance and the cortical recruitment may be a consequence of age-related differences in the brain structure, particularly the microstructure integrity of the white matter. So remember that I have mentioned that the two hemispheres has been linked via the neural bundle, the corpus callosum. So corpus callosum could be one of the important structure that mediates the reduction of the hemispheric differences throughout the age. Because the previous studies have suggested that the interhemispheric interactions, the corpus callosum will play a critical role during this kind of task. And when the task is getting more and more difficult, the corpus callosum play a more and more important role in transmitting the information between the two hemispheres. So to address the structural changes across the lifespan between young and older adults, we conduct a diffusion tensor imaging study. In this study, we measure the averaged FA value. When the FA, so it's an index indicating the white matter integrity. So when the FA value is higher, that means the integrity is higher. So higher values reflect the better integrity and potentially also show better cognitive performance. So we have done a lot of neuropsychological tests for both young and older adults, and then trying to correlate their behavioral performance as well as their FA values in the corpus callosum. So our correlation results show that the age-related differences will be influenced by the FA value. So this is data from the older people. So the older people show in the circles. So there's no clear correlation of the FA value and the performance. So this X is the performance. Y is the FA value. So we only see a positive correlation in the FA value and the performance for the elderly, but do not see any clear correlations for the young group. That means for age-related white matter structure integrity is an important factor that will modulate their cognitive performance. When the older participant have a better integrity, then they will also show better cognitive performance. So this is a study that we try to use a different perspective in understanding the structural differences. So aging is a process that occurs in a really, really unique manner in which each individual. So it's a multidimensional process, which the individual's functional, and the structural changes, health status are all influenced by a variety of genetic, maybe environmental and cultural factors. So that we see that the brain's ability to cope and change throughout the lifespan is getting less and less for the elderly. That means for older people, if their performance is good, they need to do a lot of effort in modulate their neural mechanisms. So now I'm going to switch to the second topic, actually get into the topic of look into the individual variations, because as I just mentioned that aging is a multidimensional process. So that we need to, in order to understand the language processing and their cognitive performance, maybe we need to consider many different factors that will impact their performance and structural changes. So some study we have done in Hong Kong, but also some studies we done in Taiwan. So in the Hong Kong study, we first, in order to study Hong Kong Cantonese speakers, we first established a corpus because Hong Kong Cantonese is very different from Mandarin, from 普通话, from Chinese, as well as it's very different from Guangzhou Cantonese. So in order to study Hong Kong elderly performance and language processing, we first established a Hong Kong Cantonese category database. So this database, we established 72 semantic categories. For instance, a type of animal, a type of street food. And we asked participants to spontaneously generate some items that could go with the categories. And then we calculate the familiarity of the word and the close probability of the word that could go with the categories. For instance, so we have, in total, we have 72 categories and 1,000, more than 1,000 words in the same database. So for instance, for a specific category, a type of street food, so that participants could generate a lot of words, and then we could calculate how much time and how often the participant will mention this word as the first example. So that, for instance, 鱼蛋 is the highest exemplar when the participant look at the category of street food. And we also have the familiarity index. So after establishing this database, then we are able to study first the semantic category processing in young and older adults for the Cantonese speaker. So this is data we actually just done the data collection. So I would like to share our newly results to you. So this is young adults, and this is the data from older adults. So what we are looking into is we show the category first. For instance, a type of street food, and then wait for 1 second and showing a word. So the word would be either the highly expected word as the rating shows, as the database showed. So the first one would be 鱼蛋. So that's the best word that could go with the type of street food. Unexpected one, 捞面, is the one that participant will still be okay, but it's that only a few participants will generate this exemplar, this word, and that will go with the street food. So it's a good exemplar, but it's atypical type of word that go with the category. So the last one is a incongruent one, glass. So we first establish a baseline for young adults. So we look at the typicality effect and the congruency effects on the word. So we are looking here is that when the word is highly expected, then that's the black line. It shows very small N400. So that's the participants get ready for processing. So that's, they don't need to spend a lot of effort in integrating the highly expected word, so the typical word. So a typical one, the red color, show a little bit more negativity, N400, than the typical one. So that's also consistent with the literature. So that atypical item takes more effort in integrating the information. So for the incongruent one, we show a largest N400. So that the young adults, we demonstrate the graded N400 effect across the expected, less expected, and totally incongruent. So what about the older adults? Do they show similar patterns? So in fact, this is our older adults. We have 30 participants, and then we see that the older people show somehow very similar and even a little bit cleaner data than the young adults. So that the older people also show graded N400 effect in the semantic categorization. So in this set of data, we are now trying to look into the individual variations in both young and older adults by use of a lot of questionnaires. So this is the data set we collected in Hong Kong. We also done some similar studies in Taiwan. So in Taiwan, we utilize an auditory sentence processing. Why we use auditory? Because we notice that for some of the older people, their reading ability may not be good, so that we still want to know whether their auditory language comprehension is okay or not. So in Taiwan, we established an auditory set of data. So we present the sentence in an auditorial way. So in the study, we have a 2x2 design. So the first variable is a constraint. So the sentence constraint. So high C means a sentence information provide a lot of information. So that means the participant, when they hear the sentence until the end of before the target, the participant could get ready for processing the target. For instance, enter the amusement park, we need to firstly buy something. So this is counted as a high constraint sentence because the sentence itself, although it is unfinished, but it already contains a lot of information. So the participant could use the context to get prepared for processing the final word. So that's a target. Less constraint, LC, is a sentence type that do not provide a lot of information. So that, for instance, his new hairstyle look very something. So this kind of low constraint sentence do not provide informative info for processing for prediction. So our ERPs are looking at the target processing. So the target will be the high close probability, means that most of the participants will say ticket will be the best word to complete the sentence or another word. So there's a 2x2 design, the constraint of the context and the probability of the target. So this is the data we collected in Taiwan. So for young adults, we look at the high constraint sentence and the low constraint sentence. And this is an ERP result on the final word. So what we see here, again, the red line is the unexpected one, but the sentences are okay, but the final word is less expected, so that the participant need to think about the sentence again. So the unexpected word will all generate a little bit more negative N400 than the expected word. So this pattern is true for both high constraint sentence and low constraint sentence. Interestingly, for the high constraint sentence, which provide a lot of information for prediction, there's one more thing that show up at the end of the component, and it's also shown on the frontal areas. So this is the frontal positivity. So there's a effect. Frontal positivity reflects the brain process for revision. When the sentence provides a lot of information to horn in a specific word, however, when the word show up, that's not the word that they predict. The participant need to engage a revision process to rethink the sentence again. So for young adults, the revision process will be utilized when the sentence is high constraint, but there's no this kind of information for low constraint. So this is young adult data for high constraint, low constraint. Okay. So what about the older people? So this is the older adults. Again, we collect data from about 20-something, 25 participants. So this is a high constraint sentence, and this is low constraint sentence. So what we see here is that older adults seems like they do only show it, also show the N400 effect for the final word expectancy. But the N400 is a little bit delayed, but there's no, actually the N400 differences for expectancy is not very clear when the sentence is less constrained. That means for all the older people, they could process the high constraint sentence very efficiently. But for those low constraint sentence, they will just wait and see whether the sentence is okay or not. So we wonder whether there are some of the older participants, and that will show young-like data. So in the literature, it has demonstrated that for some of the older people, they will show revision process just like the young participants. So in this study, we done a lot of neuropsychology assessments as well. So we use their verbal fluency to split the participant into halves. So verbal fluency is a task to test whether a participant, how many words the participant could generate in 1 minute. For instance, please say a type of flower in 1 minute. So in the past, it has demonstrated that high verbal fluency older adults will be more like a young people using the language processing in the neural mechanisms. So what we found here, so we found very similar data as the literature showed. So high verbal fluency older adults. So this is high verbal fluency older adults, and this is low verbal fluency older adults. And now we are looking at the high constraint sentences. So the young adults will show the when the word is unexpected, but the young adult will be able to revise their prediction and reintegrate the sentence. So now we look at this component here, the frontal positivity component. It shows that for the high verbal fluency older adults as well. So that means for high verbal fluency older adults, their ERP patterns for processing sentence is just like the younger adults. For lower verbal fluency older adults, they do not show the revision-related ERP components. However, very interesting thing, we also see the dynamic of the compensatory processing. So for low verbal fluency older adults, they engage more attentional related process. So for the word that is expected, the lower verbal fluency older adults, they will put their attention and horn into this kind of sentence. So that's the modulation for lower verbal fluency older adults. They will focus on the high constraint sentence, but they do not explicit the revision process. So that is the data that we're trying to look into the different older participants. So for the high verbal fluency older adults, it's more like the young pattern. But the lower verbal fluency, they look into they use more attentional resources in processing the sentence at the very beginning. So one last study I would like to share that is done with the single word as well. So we asked the participants to just look at the single word because we're trying to know that despite we know at the word level, most of the older adults are okay. However, as I mentioned that Chinese is very special. So for each Chinese character, it carries meaning. And a lot of Chinese words that could carry multiple meanings. So that I asked a group of elderly to just look at the compound words and do a lexical decision task. So in this study, we recruit 50 healthy older participants. those participants do not have any depression and they are okay in all the cognitive tests. So we look at their behavioral responses, and older people also show the ambiguity effect. So ambiguous word show longer reaction time than non-ambiguous word. And the pseudo words, the no responses, also show longer reaction time than words. So that's consistent with young adults. For accuracy, we see that the older people are doing pretty good in the accuracy. So what's interesting in this study is that we try to look into whether the participants, if they have their loneliness scales is higher, whether that will impact their word processing. So a series of simple linear regression analysis were conducted, trying to investigate whether the loneliness score will predict their reaction times in lexical decision. So we found out that, very interestingly, the loneliness score will not predict their overall reaction time, will not predict their overall word processing. Also, the loneliness score will not predict the lexicality. Lexicality means that the ability to differentiate word versus non-word. However, the perceived loneliness score is significantly modulates their ambiguity resolution. That means when the participant has higher loneliness scores, then they have poor ability in resolve the ambiguities. So this has some implication because to resolve the lexical ambiguity, the sublexical ambiguity in reading Chinese. So for instance, what is the meaning of this word, hua? So the participants actually need to look into the information from the second character, whether it's something that's related flower or spend money. So the participants need to look and pay attention to the relationships between the words. However, it seems like for loneliness, higher loneliness rating participants, those people has a higher tendency that they do not care about other things. So it seems like this kind of tendency also impacts their ability to solve the sublexical ambiguity in reading Chinese. So that's the higher perceived loneliness scores will impact their ability to actually get the correct meaning when the word is ambiguous. So this has some of the implications as well. So overall, I would like to conclude what I have talked about today. So overall, older adults may be okay to preserve functions for the mechanisms for processing words and also produce language. However, with age, there are a lot of different top-down circuits that may be engaged for processing. Maybe there are some of the internal structurals and also the compensatory mechanism being involved. And secondly, there are individual differences in their microstructure integrity of corpus callosum, and that will related to their age-related cognitive performance difference. And third, and that's associated with the final study I just talked about, the severity of perceived loneliness is associated with the impairment in higher level language functioning in the elderly, and which may influence their effective of communication in carrying their everyday life. So that, again, language processing and reading is not just a one interesting and also appreciate activities for elderly, but reading and language comprehension ability will help elderly to maintain a functional independency and also have a significant impact on their life quality. So for caregivers, they need to be cautious in using the different words in communication, because maybe for some of the higher loneliness elderlies, they have difficulties in processing ambiguous or complex words. At the end, a broader understanding of interactions between the language and brain dynamics and maybe cognitive abilities will promise a more inclusive view of maintaining or promoting healthy mind. So I'm just trying to look into all this kind of mechanisms by using language materials. So all my work has been not only done with my group, I also have a lot of collaborations with different research groups. So I would like to thank all my collaborators in United States as well as in Taiwan, and also my group in CTU. Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay, we thank Professor Huang providing this excellent talk to describe how she has done so rich evidence regarding the language and for the older people and across Hong Kong and Taiwan. I especially think that it is very interesting to study the Cantonese. Yes, especially there. They have the written language for their spoken language. That is hardly, yes. I think that is also interesting. Okay, but I think I need to give the time to the audience and our students to see whether they have some questions or they have some opinions that they want to seek from your side. Okay, sure. So may I invite whether we have any students or some audience who wants to ask? Okay. I think some of the students are a little bit shy, so they just type.
Oh, okay.
Yes. You can see here is the first question from Vika. Okay.
Let me see whether I can see the...
Can you see it?
Not yet. Okay, let me see the...
I think there's an icon, like, you know, the talking bubble. If you click on that, then it will show up the chat.
You can read for her.
Yeah, maybe you can just read for me.
Sure, no problem. So that is, the question is, what is the implication of this research for clinical practice or your suggestion for clinical therapies? I think the student is asking that because she is a physiotherapist. Okay, she's a physiotherapist. So she may thinking about how your finding can be translated into their clinical practice.
Sure. So I think firstly, I think we need to know that the two hemispheres play different roles in understanding language. So now maybe we could use different strategies in the language communication and also make their therapy more efficient. For instance, more explicit or more imageable, like some pictures, not only just the verbally presented information. Maybe some of the pictures or examples could be shown to the elderly, and that will be easier for them to mimic and try to make the practice. And secondly, due to the huge variations for the elderly, and we know that the elderly has declined attention, memory, and executive functions. So now maybe it will be better to use shorter and shorter words and simple sentences in conveying the message. And third, I think the important implication, and that's for the healthcare for the elderly. For that, for instance, maybe when the words are a lot of times sentences are ambiguous.
OK。
A lot of
好像还没那个乃文，我跟他再约晚一点。我跟他
Sorry, can our audience and students please to turn up your microphone?
It's only you have the authority could shut down everybody's microphone.
你加个姐姐别当朋友。
I am not, because I'm not a host.
The chairperson can switch off everybody's microphone.
Yeah. Okay. So the implication for a caregiver is that we need to know that a lot of times sentences are ambiguous. A lot of times, for instance, pronouns, they, he, and she, this kind of pronouns are also very ambiguous. So that for efficient communication, I think a clear message need to be sent, especially in communicating with the elderly, because it's challenging for them to try to make the linkage of what you are talking about now. When this is ambiguous, maybe the elderly are more difficult and taking more time in getting the implicit meaning. So that's, I think that's the implication for the healthcare and the daily communications with the elderly.
Thank you. The students, I think the student understands. So she also said, thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So may I know if there are more questions from the students or from the audience? You can type in the chat room if you think that you do not want to speak, and I can speak it out, no problem. Okay, well, they are still digesting the bombard information. I'm thinking one thing is that you have mentioned that it is better to use the short sentences in addition to some complicated sentences.
Yeah.
So can you give some examples of how short it should be if we really want to give these kind of instructions? And yes.
Yeah, so for example, in my study, I always use a relatively simple sentence here. This kind. I always use relatively easy structures. So I don't use a lot of phrase in phrase sentence. So this kind of simple sentence will be better, I think, for the communication. And also in the literature, not for my own research, in the literature, we have found that when the sentences are more complex, for instance, it has a lot of clauses, and that will create huge difficulties for the elderly to comprehend. Yeah.
Okay. And following this, if we have, unfortunately, have a complicated scenario that we need to explain to the older people first, and then get into our instruction.
Sure.
Then if this is the case, what will be your suggestions?
So I would suggest that not only use the words, maybe show, if it's possible, maybe show some short videos to them, so that will reduce their anxiety, and also they will be able to really know what you want. So this is my experience of conducting a lot of elderly studies. So for elderly, they try to do their best, but their anxiety is really high. So that we always trying to give some clear demonstration, so that we'll play a short video and telling them what it look like to conduct or to do this task, so that they have expectation to meet, so that they will reduce their anxiety.
Okay, so we need to put efforts on it.
Yeah, and also that's because when their anxiety is lowered, they could really show their ability to us.
And I just wondering, so in your research, all of the older people are healthy older people, am I right?
Yes.
Okay, so so here's a tough question for you. So if there are some older people with cognitive impairment, or they have some kind of like Alzheimer's disease,
sure.
In this condition, do you think that their brain sciences will keep the same as that you have studied on the?
Yeah, your easy answer is yes, they will be different. So in fact, in our study, we try to look into the healthy side, is because we try to know what kind of factors could promote a healthy mind. So that's why we always collect healthy older adults. But we do see that it's a spectrum. So we do see some of the older adults that are toward not very good side spectrums. So we do see that there are a lot of factors we need to consider. So that's why it needs a lot of work. So we look into maybe their education, their job complexity, this kind of thing. So we will ask a lot of details. For instance, even their education level is really, really low, but in Hong Kong, some of the older people, their job complexity is high, so they need it's necessary for communication. So now it will impact to their language ability. So what I want to say is, we do see a lot of factors will come into play, a role in impacts their overall cognitive abilities. We do collect some of the data that's from, it seems like the participants is within the MCI, the mild cognitive impairment. So that's most of their cognitive ability overall, not including the language processing. It will be very different from other healthier adults. True.
Okay, thank you. May I ask one more time about our students and audience? Any questions or any opinions, comments are welcome? Still too shy? I think this is the feature of Asians, right? Okay. Then I think I can ask more. Okay.
Sure.
It is not under a study, but I think you also know that in Hong Kong people now they are in a transition that they need to learn different languages.
Yeah.
They are talking about 两文三语, right?
Yes.
Yes. And so, have you looked into those who are only know one language versus those who know, they have the integrate languages together?
We do. In fact, I did that in Taiwan sample too, because in Hong Kong it's more difficult because most of the Hong Kong elderly, they could speak at least 2 languages. So either Cantonese and English, or Cantonese and Mandarin. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's very difficult to get a very clear, very clean monolingual. But in Taiwan, we have done a little bit. So Taiwan is also a very multilingual environment. So we have collected some of the older people who have only knowing Mandarin versus some of the older people who know at least 2 languages, Southern Ming and Chinese. So it's true that for some of the elderly, when they have multilingual experiences, it seems like their overall general cognitive performance is a little bit higher than the monolingual ones. But the tricky things to test their language ability is we need to know what is the best language to test their language ability, whether the fluency, their language fluency will impact. Yeah, so that's the tricky part for testing the language ability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's more harder to control, right?
Yeah. But we do consider this is a factor. In fact, I think personally, I think multilingual experiences is quite a stimulating exercise.
Yes. Okay. I think because of the time, okay, although our timetable is that we can up to 4, okay, but I know that talking about 1.5 hours is very, 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 very tired. So I think if there's no more questions, then I would like to end today's talk here. Okay, and I think we thank again for Professor Huang to deliver this excellent and promising research. And she has showed up her QR code and her email. So if after some time our students digest the information, then I think our students may contact Professor Huang to further discuss.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And see you.
Bye-bye. Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.